I was living in Tbilisi a few years ago, the capital of the Republic of Georgia. I was running a kind of legally ambiguous consumer credit operation when I figured it was time I took a much-needed weekend getaway in a nearby small town. The town I settled on is an extremely popular tourist location given its beautiful location along a river nestled in a deep valley and rife with ancient churches. With many options for potential guest houses, hotels and rentals, I decided to not book in advance and to just traipse around until I found something appropriate. I found a very adequate guest house perched on a hill with about a 1-acre plot. Upon entering the guest house, I was greeted in typical Georgian fashion by an incredibly hospitable woman in her 60s to 90s and her son, who was in his early 30s, who resumed his yard work of filling a large hole he said was a septic tank with a foul lingering smell after a brief introduction. Again, in typical Georgian fashion, the hostess offered me tea, homemade wine, bread and cheese, all of which were much needed and fantastic. I am an American, but my family came from Eastern Europe, so I speak Russian as most Georgians do, so we were able to chat a lot. Our conversation progressed from basic get-to-know-you bits to more personal information like whether I am seeing anyone and who I am dating, which does come up in surprising frequency when you meet sweet grandmothers who want you to meet their granddaughters. At the time I was dating a fellow expat from a Western European country. When I told the hostess that I was seeing someone, she seemed thrilled and asked me to show her a photo. She reacted with an awe and nodded in approval, commenting on her physique in a way that would probably be inappropriate if it wasn't a cute old grandma. I was then pressed by the hostess as to why I didn't invite her and how that isn't what a good boyfriend would do. Put on the spot like this, I lied and said she was very busy with a work project. She wasn't, but would be arriving later in the evening. Didn't ask. The hostess was elated by this news and called over her son and asked me to show the photo of the girl I was seeing. Early in our conversation it was established that I do not speak in Georgian. The son saw the photo and affirmatively nodded and spoke in Georgian to the hostess briefly, and then turned to me with a beaming smile and a thumbs up and said in English, "Very pretty, you lucky brother." He then in Russian asked if I texted her to invite her. I lied and said I did text her and reiterated that she was arriving in a few hours. It was around 4 p.m. at the time in a beautiful golden hour glow that lit up the surrounding mountains and valley. The son said he will join us and asked if I liked cha-cha. Cha-cha is the very strong national liquor of Georgia, ranging from 30 to 75% alcohol content and made from distilled grapes. I'd become quite the savant of cha-cha, and despite some strange feelings about their fixation on the female visitor, I obliged. Cha-cha is not for the weak-hearted, but I was very used to consuming it at the time. I should have paid more notice to the very intentional placement of the shots he filled for us, but I pushed those misgivings aside and had the shot after a very traditional toast. Around 20 minutes later I felt exhausted and ill and excused myself to my room, saying I needed a quick nap. Walking to my room I knew something was amiss. As mentioned in the beginning, I was fronting a questionable business and I did have a firearm in my bag and made a mental note to take it and put it under my pillow, but as one can imagine, it isn't easy to remember things even on short term when apparently drugged. Despite failing to collect my weapon, I did close my blinds as the afternoon sun was blaring into the room and I wanted darkness. Passing out at around 4:30 p.m. I awoke to darkness at 4:45 a.m. with a raging headache. My window shades were partially open despite me closing them before passing out. They were opened with about 2 feet of space visible to the outside. My bags were not in the position I left them, and the television was on and on high volume despite me never using it, and the door was only partially closed. I peered out the window and didn't see anything, so I quickly went to my bag, retrieved my firearm and went to the bathroom with the intention of calling my coworkers or a driver to pick me up. I had no cell service and no Wi-Fi despite having perfectly fine reception the day prior. I went back to the bed with the weapon under the pillow with zero desire or inclination to fall back asleep. After an hour or so of pretending to be asleep, I saw the sun peer through the window to get a look inside. At this point I was certain it was not my imagination playing tricks on me and that I was in trouble. I came out around sunrise to find both the hostess and her son sipping tea on the deck, and told the hostess that my girlfriend was arriving soon on a bus and that I'd bring her when it arrived. I grabbed my backpack and left my other bag to give the impression I wasn't fleeing. Got service immediately after leaving the property and called a partner to pick me up. Old school businessman who was floating the money I'd run a lending operation with. I told him the story and he said he would handle it. He did handle it. I still think about the foul-smelling hole the son was digging. Last guest? Weeks later I decided that wasn't the place or business for me and applied to law school in the other side of the world. I had just turned 21 and frequented the bars regularly. In hindsight, I probably spent too much time drinking with my friends. I didn't have a car or a cell phone, and I lived on the outskirts of town. It was a 45-minute walk downtown. The town I live in is generally a very safe place. It is a wealthy, well-to-do, white-bread community, so walking home alone at night after drinking was nothing that bothered me, other than the actual walking. It was a Tuesday night, and that meant pints were cheap. So I wouldn't say I was completely wasted, but I certainly was more than tipsy. Instead of walking home along the sidewalk where I feared I'd be picked up by the police for being drunk in public, I decided to take the bike path that ran along the train tracks. This meant the walk would take longer but much safer and less likely I'd run into any sort of trouble, or so I thought. The bike path was not very lit, and knowing what I know now, I should have been a lot more nervous about walking alone in the complete darkness at 2 in the morning. Like I said, I had just turned 21 and was certainly an arrogant young male who was thinking about women and not minding my surroundings. I had taken this path many nights and coming across anybody else was rare. If I did perchance come across somebody this late at night, most of the time it was just another drunk college student who had the same thoughts as me. Either that, or they were homeless, but if so, I'd say they were all harmless. So this night as I'm walking, I noticed further down the path was somebody walking towards me. He wore a large hiking backpack and had his hoodie pulled over his head. It was so dark I couldn't see their face. I could really only just barely make out their outline. This person's gait unquestionably revealed him to be a male who I figured was probably just a transient. It was odd to see somebody walking towards downtown at 2 in the morning. When I got really close to him and we were about to cross paths, this person just stopped dead in his tracks, and I could tell he was staring at me because his head just followed me as I walked by. It creeped me out a bit, and I certainly felt like that was a bit odd. As I continued to walk, shrugging at the situation, I just didn't feel right. Something in my gut made me feel wrong. I stopped and turned around to see this person still staring at me. "What?" I asked him as I stopped walking and remained to stare back at him. That's when he hissed at me. Like a snake. A long, vicious-sounding hiss that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had hoped he was just being weird or perhaps was on meth or something. I nervously laughed a bit and said, okay," and continued to walk on. I made it a few more steps and turned to look back. He somehow managed to get closer to me without making a sound. He stood completely still. I figured perhaps I was just drunk and imagining things. I turned back around and walked, taking a few more steps. I turned around once more. Now I knew he was closer. I couldn't believe I couldn't hear him approaching behind me. What unsettled me, even more, was how every time I turned around he'd manage to stop and stand completely still. Are you following me, buddy?" Once again he let out this creepy hiss, just staring at me. Now I was freaked out and had this strange sensation that I was some sort of prey. "Hey, fuck you, man," I now yelled. In hindsight this was a bad idea, but because I already felt like I was some sort of target and the last thing I should have been wanting to do is provoke this sick, twisted bastard. I started backing away at this point, not taking my eyes off of him. He just stood there hissing. The hisses were getting longer, louder, and more malice was apparent in him. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, they were basic steps, but the further I backed away, the more he sped up, taking bigger steps towards me. I said forget this to myself. I'm getting out of here. I noped it out of there and began into a full-fledged run. He started running after me. I could hear his heavy boots gaining on me. Hissing like a cat, growling like a dog. I feel his spit hitting me in the back of the neck. "Get away from me," I yelled. I might have peed myself. I was so scared. All I could think to do was run as fast as I could and to get inside of my house as quickly as possible. I've always been a very fast runner. But this guy was much taller than me and his legs were really long, so he was really cutting down the distance between him and me. I managed to keep a good 5 between us, though, checking back behind me as I saw his arms reaching out in an attempt to grab me. I finally made it out of the bike path and onto the crossing sidewalk of the street that was lit up by street lamps and a few passing cars. I was so relieved to finally make it back to civilization. There was a gas station over by my house and I thought I'd run to the safety of its inside, only to see that the lights had been shut off and the doors were closed. It was closed. I had to make it to my house. As I got closer to my house I could see my roommate's lights were on through the window. "Chris!" I shouted. "Chris, open the door! Open the door!" I'm impressed I yelled loud enough that he actually heard me. I saw the front door of my house open up and my roommate standing at the doorway looking confused. I ran up the steps and almost jumped inside my house, slamming the door shut behind me. "Dude, what are you running from?" he asked. You didn't see the guy chasing me?" "No." I ran to the window and looked outside. He was gone. I have no idea what happened to him, but I am sure that had really happened. Whoever the guy who hissed at me was really shook me up, and I never walked down that bike path after dark anymore.